All right. Hello, everyone. This is the November 4th edition of the SIG Release meeting. This is a meeting that is recorded and available on the internet, so please be mindful of what you say, what you do. Please be sure to adhere to the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, and in general, just be awesome people. We've got a light agenda today. Looks like Tim, I know Tim said he was going to be on spotty connection, but looks like Tim has some action items up, discussion items up for LTS group and release notes quality. So Tim, if you want to and are able to kick it off, go for it. For the people who are on the call, please drop your name in the agenda. If anyone is interested in taking notes and is able to, please also do that. Thank you.
So I guess I can try and talk about the LTS thing, and I know Josh Burkus has given it a read through and could probably speak to it some as well, but I haven't brought this up in a whole lot of detail. I've mentioned it on and off over the last months, but I haven't gone into detail because the working group has been fairly all over the place in terms of what they're exploring, thinking about, talking about, and discussing, and multiple potential things that might be or might have been kept have been in flight. And this is the first one that's looking to be something concrete enough to actually share out further. So the gist of it is, the TLDR is, what would it look like if instead of supporting a release for 9 months, we did it for 12? And then slight twist on that, it's not actually 9 today because we sort of do 9 plus 6 or 7 weeks, and that part's been particularly fuzzy. So the part of the proposal would be to make that not fuzzy and call it actually a 14-month support window where that trailing period is actually formally part of it. And it's probably, because it's not really been defined specifically in the discussion there, but the discussion was tending like, if we have this fuzzy point of these trailing weeks or months where we still have CI running, but we're really trying to convince people to move off of the thing, having less patches move into it would be part of that motivation perhaps, but sort of nailing down concretely that only during that final trailing period are CVEs merged into the branch specifically. So that's kind of the TLDR on it, but there's a whole lot more detail behind it. I don't know, Josh, if you want to add other things there.
Yeah. There's a whole bunch of detail behind it. There's more to work out for the cap.
Much more, yeah.
Thing number one is, what is it going to cost us to do this period? That is, what do we need in terms of extra resources? How much extra work is it going to be? And the second thing is, the value of it is also undefined. We did an LTS survey of a whole bunch of users, but we didn't specifically ask whether extending patches to 12 plus months would help people. So we don't actually know. Like, we know it'll help some people, but is some people 3% of our users, or is it 30% of our users? We have no idea. And obviously, if the cost is going to be high, then we need to have some idea that the benefit is also going to be substantial. So that's kind of where we are with that. You'll see some discussion from me in there, where I'm pointing out a contradictory use case, that is, for the use case that are large enterprise customers, they actually don't care about 9 versus 12 months because the support window they're looking for is 2 to 5 years. So for them, it doesn't actually make a difference. So we have one substantial counter case. So we need to figure out what percentage of our, or what sort of size of the user bases that fit in various buckets are, which may mean doing another survey.
One of the big gaps there too is we don't understand our user base today. Obviously, those people who are looking for 2 to 5 years of support aren't getting it from us. They're ignored as far as the community support is concerned. So of the remainder, is that the majority of Kubernetes users or a tiny portion? So maybe maybe like Josh said, sort of this 3% number, say 3% of people really like this, but is that 90% of the community people who use our artifacts, or is it 1% of all of the users? Like the statistics get skewed so many different ways.
Now, we did ask questions about where people get their binaries, so it might be worth delving into that again.
Yeah, I
Because
think that
data
some of this might be inferable from the data, and we've got to go try and dig that out a little better.
Anybody have any comments, or is this just me and Tim? I agree. Yeah, I think there's still some work to be done. I can say from a release engineering standpoint that if you're, it's not easy to consume Kubernetes pre-releases right now. So there's a good likelihood that people are not doing it. There will probably be a cycle and a half of work to get us to a point where we can consume pre-releases, or people can consume pre-releases easily. So I would lean in on the data around how people are upgrading Kubernetes today, how they are installing Kubernetes in the first place. I know there are a bunch of personas that we created in that survey. So yeah, deep diving on those personas. Like if they're not look at the service providers as opposed to the people who are consuming something from a managed service, because we kind of already know the answer to that there, and go, make assumptions like that, right?
Yeah. The other thing that I would like to follow up on would be with some of the service providers themselves, which should be relatively easy because, each of us sort of works for them, right? Yes. Which is to find out for the service providers what sort of, if there is any LTS scheme that would actually benefit the service provider, that would presumably cut work for them, meaning theoretically they have more people to devote to upstream, or whether there isn't any. I'll tell you that my employer, based on their experience with LTS releases for the Linux kernel, doesn't believe that any kind of LTS release from the Kubernetes project would make a difference in the amount of time that we spend on building OpenShift. But that's one of several providers. And, would Google be different? Would VMware be different? Don't know at this point.
One of the things that I think is worth discussing within that sort of counter argument is, do we need patch releases at all? If the vendors have this all covered, could we just stop doing that?
So it seems like a two-part question to take back to the people who do all the build work at the service providers.
Yeah, that second part is a huge discussion, I feel.
Yeah. I mean, but I mean, like one part of where that came from was Tim and I were discussing the comparison with the Linux kernel. And I don't know about other Linux vendors, but I'll tell you, we cherry pick based on what we believe the priorities are for our customers in terms of patches, which means, and so you look at that as sort of a model, and the Linux kernel still does numbered releases, but we aren't really using them. And are things going to go the same way with Kubernetes with the large vendors?
It's also a question of, do we want it to? Do we care if it does? If we had a model where this worked for everyone, could we get service providers to adopt it the same?
I think a portion of the data there, or I suspect vendors are going to be a little loath to talk about, because a portion of this is their value add. At the same time, we should be able to see it in their code if they are making their code available. They may not be. The one difference, I think, compared to the Linux kernel with the GPL, there would be an obligation for that code to be visible, and in an Apache
Yeah.
license scenario, we may not see what a vendor delivers.
Yeah, you can see ours, but it's not true of everybody.
So do we have people from non-vendor companies that want to jump in on this discussion? Or people who are not Tim, Josh, and I?
I'd say I do like that overall discourse about so long as somebody has the binary to take care of this. I think that I've seen in my experience that, working for my company as well as working with other people in other companies, non-vendor companies, so long as there's been the availability of a managed solution, whether that be in Azure, AWS, wherever, that has been good enough to kind of encapsulate and take care of any worries that we have ever had. So I think that I really do think that the community is doing the right thing, but I would love to look at the data, wherever we can, and kind of form that opinion on, like you had said, is it 3%, 30%, or more?
On the one thing that I didn't say from the KEP discussion, it really kind of started from a point of, like, we see two modes in the data where people want longer support and people are moving rapidly forward to the latest releases. Within the longer support area, a lot of people have commented, both anecdotally in discussions or face-to-face at conferences, as well as in the survey. There were a few where they're just used to doing an annual cycle. Business cycles tend to be annual. So today, if you do an upgrade, you might upgrade in April, and then in October, and then in February, or just like the cadence can be really disjointed and awkward from a planning perspective. So to have a scenario where people could stay within support and know, for our given business cycles, we have a gap where we can do some major upgrading annually in this particular quarter, plan phase in, plan go production type of thing, that people see benefit in that, and that's a common pattern in industry.
And I mean, it also raises the question, if we can get to a point where, Todd, I think you're unmuted, if you mind muting.
Sure. I'd like to get in this discussion at some point.
Okay, cool. Yeah. No, go for it, actually.
Yeah, sorry. My audio wasn't working before, so I had to dial in again. So we look to this group to test and support Kubernetes, so that your lifetime of your support cycle directly affects the support cycle of our products. And we've had opportunities or situations where we were strongly tempted to take a patch release to an unsupported version of Kubernetes, and we decided not to do that to support our customers because you all test the product more thoroughly than we ever could with the resources that we have. So I just wanted to throw that in there, and I'll try and mute myself now.
No, that's extremely valuable. Who do you work for? Can you say?
I work for Pivotal.
Oh, cool. Okay. So 12 months would make a difference to you guys then.
Yeah, the length of time affects the length of time that we can ship that version of Kubernetes.
Okay.
And obviously our customers, our enterprise customers, they would prefer longer. But what's the exact value add? I can't give you a number of that though, okay, on the drive.
Yeah. Can you comment on the cap as well?
On which?
The cap. It's linked from today's notes. Even if you're not looking at it now, look at today's notes later and comment on the cap. That would be helpful.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what was your question?
So he was asking you to comment on the KEP, the Kubernetes enhancement proposal around this topic. That's going to be that is already linked in the in today's notes.
I will do that. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Thank you for the feedback. So yeah, from the service provider perspective, it's kind of clear to see that, being able to do the stuff faster means that we can, one, test things faster, and then also support things for longer, if needed. I felt this a little at CoreOS too, as we were doing the CoreOS Red Hat merger, and also having to support Tectonic as Tectonic's version was going out of support in the upstream community, right? So having a little bit of that window. I think that was right around the time that we announced, like 112 or so, we announced a major CVE and had to do a patch for something that we were about to call unsupported. So I think having that breathing room, even if it's something like 6 months or something, is a huge benefit to people who move a little faster on this. Also, from the perspective of the persona who does not plan to upgrade frequently, because it is rooted in however they do business, being able to provide mechanisms for upgrading faster might change the way they do business in the first place. So we should also consider that we might be able to shift a persona from that we're kind of hesitant because we don't know how all these pieces work to we can do it because we trust the community.
Something else that this KEP doesn't directly touch on, upgrades. The working group has spent a lot of time discussing like support lifetimes and support upgrade paths. And those two relate, but in some ways are separate. One of the
Yeah.
things that this KEP would cause for a potential problem, if you upgrade your systems in place, you would now need to step them forward and iteratively visit every release from the prior year. So you say you're on 112, you'd have to upgrade to 113, to 114, to 115, to 116, and there you have your next year that you could sit there. That's because of how deprecation policies and version SKUs are supported. So today, upgrade is relatively painful if you're upgrading clusters in place and you have them running at a particular version for a long time. This KEP would actually make that worse. Now, there's things that have been discussed around making tooling that makes upgrade easier, but there's also a large philosophical movement around don't do this. If you deploy a cluster, try to make it as immutable as possible. And if you're shifting your enterprise or your supported platform to a newer version that you're doing some sort of a cluster blue-green deployment where you bring up the new cluster and move workloads over to it, as opposed to upgrading a particular node in the control plane from 1.12 to 1.16.
Yeah, I'm sorry about the way I phrased that. I should have clarified that I meant upgrade insofar as moving to a new version of Kubernetes, however you're doing that. My preference is towards standing up the new migrating workloads, as you mentioned, and tearing down the old. That's the ideal scenario, and that's a scenario where I don't think that we should I don't think that we should aspire to support too much of the upgrade scenario outside of making sure that we're adhering to whatever API guarantees, whatever feature or tooling guarantees that we've already made within the deprecation and support policies.
Okay, we have some other stuff on the agenda. I think we covered this as much as we can until we have more information.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. Anybody else have ending remarks for this one?
I guess the final thing would be if you're at Contributor Summit, there is a morning session to talk about this. It should be a fun discussion in the room.
Yay. Yes, KubeCon. It's coming soon, so soon. All right, so next topic is also Tim regarding release notes. You want to shoot for it?
So this is kind of a weird one. I don't know. I'm curious to see what people think, how much this falls within our scope. On the patch releases, I've been seeing the release notes go by, and sometimes the quality has varied. But what we had in the most recent patch release was one of the patch releases had nothing in its changelog. Now, it turned out that that was a bug, and we fixed it, But as I was looking through other change logs, trying to see like, have we fixed the problem? And that meant reading what was there in the change logs. And I kind of noticed some of the change logs are not super meaningful. And that got me looking at our guidance on when and where to put a release note on a PR. And it feels fairly weak. Now, I could see from a SIG release perspective saying that we're responsible for the mechanism. We just collate what the community does. And it's hard for us to drive change across 2,000 or 3,000 people. But if the change logs are really, really long and yet have very little actionable or concrete information that a reader could look at and understand, that diminishes their value. So I feel like we should not just be publishing the changelog, but trying to make sure that the changelog has high quality. I'm wondering what other people's thoughts on that are.
Yeah, so my feeling there is that there's a lot of stuff happening all at the same time. If we touch something, part of our goal should be to make it better, even if it's not directly correlated with our SIG, right? Because we own the release notes process. Yes, we are responsible for the tooling and the documentation around how that process functions. But if we're touching a PR like you are in the patch release team, I think there is some responsibility there to make sure that the release notes make sense, right? From my perspective as a reviewer and approver, if I see, and Tim, I know you do the same, if I see a commit message, whether it's a commit message, a PR description, or a title of a PR or issue that looks off or doesn't provide enough context, I will ask, and I will hold the PR, and I will ask the person to update the commit message, as well as whatever's in the PR description. I think that one repo, for example, Kubernetes org, right, where we do a commit per action, right? If we add a person to, if we never bulk add people. We may bulk add within a PR, but within that PR are individual commits for each of the add removes that we're doing, right? And the reason for that is because this is all related to org membership and our team GitHub team membership, and it's important that we can pop something off of the commit history if we need to understand exactly what was happening at that time. So I think that it's super important to try to make sure, if you are a reviewer or approver and something, think of it this way: imagine you were only able to glean what was happening about that PR from its commit message, right? If you feel like you cannot do that from the commit message and the resulting description, then it should be fixed, right? And now imagine so that's from the context of an actual reviewer or approver of that piece of code, right? You may already have context about what's happening. Imagine someone who is a new contributor. Imagine someone who is also touching that repo who is unable to easily glean that context. How can we make it easier for them to do that, right? And a large part of that is making sure that your issue descriptions, your PR descriptions, your commit messages, your release notes are up to date and clear. And so, like, if I say I've updated config, right? Updated config is not a great commit message, right? If I do SIG release updated config for build jobs, for build and staging jobs or something like that, right? That gives the person who's flying by the Git log a little bit more information about exactly what's happening in that PR without having to dig into the code. So we should consider that with everything that we're doing. But in the larger scope of everything, it's a community problem, right? This is something that, from the release notes perspective, yes, we should try to bolster that, but this is also contributor experience. How do we make sure that the documentation around the way that we commit code, whether it's in Kubernetes community devel guide and what have you, how do we make sure that documentation is very explicit about the ways to write good issues, to write good PRs, to write good commit messages, right? And there's documentation for this all across the internet. We just need to collate it, or someone needs to collate it.
Quick question, Tim. Since you're the one that brought it up, do you have any recommendations? Is there something that we have written down somewhere that we are not doing, or is it just something that we don't currently have a solution for?
The thing that I tend to fall back to is recommending a link that I just threw in the Zoom chat. It's Chris Beams. He has a post about how to make a good Git commit. And I feel like the format that he recommends involves a one-line summary, and his guidance on that one-line summary, the short log, is useful. I think for our project specifically, though, the types of things like we say we want user visible changes, but what constitutes user visible, and what's the context there? What's the end goal? What are we trying to inform the user about? I've seen a few sets of PRs where the reviewer says, "Oh, this should have a changelog because, or it should have a release note because it fixes a bug." But if the bug was never user visible, I don't know how much it matters in the end. So I think part of my end goal is figuring out if we can simplify the changelogs. I think right now, basically nobody's going to look at them. They might be sort of searchable if you have a bug you're trying to understand from a description. Hey, has somebody else seen this? Or has that thing that I was seeing maybe been fixed by somebody else? But I want to see changelogs that are actionable to a viewer and concise enough that the viewer would look at them a little more. Like the deprecations that we had in the last cycle, where we've done a lot of work to trumpet the message that they were going to be happening, but people don't see them. And I think a portion of that is just information overload, and figuring out how to be more concise would be beneficial.
And you know, and in that, I feel that we should lean towards more release notes than less, only because there is, this goes back to the personas thing, right? There is a different user for every repo, or a user personas that we're not considering for every repo, right? This is not just Kubernetes. So it's good to get into the habit of like, how do we write something that is reviewable, you know, or auditable across history, right? Like I care about this for enhancements, and for Kubernetes, and for release, and for SIG release, and for Azure, like, you know, the list goes on. So it's one of those things, like, if I'm going to submit a change to this repo, who could it potentially affect? Who do I have to care about, right? The user is not just a consumer of Kubernetes day to day, right? It might be a service provider. It might be a new contributor. You know, someone who's interested in getting involved in contributing to the code, right? That has no idea how to do it. And sometimes, you know, getting started might be going back and reading old issues, going back and reading old PRs, right? So how do we provide a platform to allow people to more easily do that? And part of it is better release notes.
Well, right now, so I linked to a 2-year-old issue discussing this topic in the notes that I brought up again last time I was release lead, which is, this has been a problem for a while, is that I really feel like we need some detailed written guidance, and that detailed written guidance needs to go through KDev and the community meeting and everything else so that people are on the same page. Because right now we are relying on people's feelings as to what they personally consider a necessary release note and a good release note. And we're relying on that both on the side of the submitter and on the side of the reviewer. And so, frankly, it's unsurprising that quality and content varies widely, right? Because people, you know, may be doing their best job, but they're doing it according to wildly different standards. You know, what I would see for adding to this is really, like, honestly, a page and a half of information about, you know, hey, if there's an API change, it requires a release note that describes the API change, unless the change was in an API that was never in a release version of Kubernetes, in which case you can skip it. Those sorts of things. I think that needs to be in there, both when is a release note necessary, because I'll tell you, working on the release team, I've seen PRs go in that, for example, deprecated an API call, de facto removed an API call and had no release note. You know, and somebody actually put release note none. Well, their perspective was, yes, this API call was released, but the reason we're removing it is no one was using it. And I'm like, well, how do you know no one was using it? You know, and on the other hand, I've seen really detailed release notes for what was a bug fix that was on a between release cycle. So the thing that was being fixed was never released. So, like Tim said, so so we don't have any guidance in this. So it's unsurprising that people just do whatever.
So, all right, so let's move towards action. I see that, yeah, this is in the backlog for both PM and release, and it's been open for 2 years. Is anyone interested in working on it?
I could work on it some, but it really needs to be somebody who's been release notes lead or on the release notes sub team sometime in the last like 5 cycles. Needs to be part of this.
Okay, yeah, for sure. We have Mike, Nick, and Lindsay currently assigned to it. I think that we should rotate this into the current and 116 release team, release notes teams to check that out. Is anyone from release note? Sasha, I see you.
Yeah, I mean,
do you have interest? I know you're working on some of the release engineering stuff, but do you have any interest in working on this as well?
oh yeah, sure. You can assign it to me. I will take care of that. We'll take a chat with Chris.
Okay, perfect. And even if this is delegating stuff out, I just want to make sure we have a more recent owner to this. So thank you for volunteering or accepting my my volunteering of you.
So do we want to try to focus on that issue 484 that Josh linked as the kind of the jumping off point towards some action, or do we need...
Brian has stuff in that issue that is not in the current release notes guide. So like even if we edited that and copied it in, would be more information than is there now. So I think it's a good start.
All right, cool. Assigned and milestoned and all that stuff are okay, not milestoned because that milestone doesn't exist. But all right, cool. So any closing remarks on this one before we move on? All righty. All right, next on the agenda is adding a kind deprecation label, right? So this ties into the release note stuff a little bit as well. The PR for that is linked, and that PR was inspired by a different PR in Kubernetes to update the PR template to add a code block to capture the deprecation note, right? So changing what the changing what the definition of of a release note is for any deprecation, right? So I felt that the Josh is plus oneing that. So I felt that we're getting to the point where we're adding a little bit too much to the template. We have to recognize that this template is used by new contributors, right? Our passerbys, where if you have a wall of text, it gets a little harder to contribute or feel like you want to contribute because there's a lot of information that you might not have the appropriate context on, and yeah, and that Yeah, so in an effort to try to minimize some of the stuff that is in the PR template, my thought was, instead of adding yet another field, we recently added one for additional documentation around KEPs, that we add a label for kind deprecation, right? And the label for kind deprecation would then obviously we do some magic in the background where if your issue or PR has a combination of the kind deprecation label as well as a release note, that release note becomes a deprecation note, right? Very simple, right? And I think that's just a few lines of code to write in, really. So that's my thought. I put the PR up so that we could start the discussion about it, because I think we've mentioned it in a few release meetings, and it's just been like, hey, I think it's a good idea if we add a label, and then nothing happens. So so I put the PR up to start the discussion. What we need to do next, because I think we're in general agreement. Bob was into it. I think Gwen was also +1 to this. The next thing that we have to do is, what I'd like it to be is a global label, right? So for us to make it a global label, we need to have a global discussion about this, right? So getting this on the SIG contributor experience agenda. And yes, absolutely, Josh. So the PROW should also warn if a PR has a kind deprecation label but no release note, or release note none. Absolutely. So all of this should be fairly easy to enforce. All we have to do is have a larger discussion about it, and get and set a lazy consensus date. It's already been LGTM'd and approved by a bunch of people. So I will move forward and set a date to discuss with the contributor experience. So anyone who, I'll try to do it for their next meeting, which is probably this Wednesday, Thursday, I don't know, I'll check the calendar. And then also maybe discuss this at the community meeting, right? Any questions, comments, concerns?
Got a question or idea, maybe kind of related back to Maria's suggestion on release notes and needing more from SIG leadership and core reviewer approver type folks. You were talking about the template being a bit of a wall of text, and I agree. Like, the more we want structure, the more throwing that in the face of the contributor themselves is daunting to them. But maybe we need like a reviewer checklist where these sets of things are documented, and the reviewer could, while they're looking at the PR, separately have open the checklist of stuff and be like, oh, this is a deprecation, let me add the deprecation label. Like, it doesn't have to be on the individual contributor to add all of the things if we have the reviewer approvers on board for the consistency.
And then that could actually be something for reviewer trainees to do.
Yeah.
I like this. I like all of it. I like the fact that we then put the onus on the people who are reviewing and approving. Again, the owners of the code, for being responsible for making sure that incoming code is of high quality, or incoming documentation is of high quality. I, as a reviewer approver myself, if I'm touching a PR that is mislabeled or missigged or kinded or what have you, I try to correct those myself, and then also drop a note in the PR that says like, hey, this actually touches this piece of code, so it should be blah, right? So kind of like, hey, we're fixing this for you, but in future, just be aware that you should do this instead, right? So that we try to, instead of making ourselves strictly responsible for this, we're also moving some of this responsibility out to the contributors who are doing it too. It should not only be their responsibility though. So
one of the things that's going to come up with this in the previous thing is, how do we reach the reviewers as a pool? Because like theoretically everybody's supposed to be reading KDev, but in practice,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky piece. I mean, the same as it could be said for the like Kubernetes SIG leads mailing list, right? Where, you know, it's one of those things where we send out an additional email to individual addresses to make sure that the SIG leads got the information. So if you are part of a Kubernetes org if you're part of the Kubernetes org or one of the sister orgs, Kubernetes SIGs, client, security, what have you, my expectation, my personal expectation, is that you are reading KDev, right? And the reason for that is our membership is contingent on you joining KDev, right? So I'm, transitively making the assumption that you are already also reading the stuff that is landing on KDev. If you're not, that's a different conversation, right? It is in our membership requirements that you join KDev, and the reason for that is because we send stuff to KDev that is important to read. So. Cool. All right. Any questions, comments about that topic?
Reviewer checklist idea. Should we maybe bring that up with Contribex, see if they've done anything previously on that, or?
Yeah, there is a contributor cheat sheet. And I wonder if it's part of that or links out somewhere. If it does exist, it might be there. If not, then I do think it's something reasonable for them to take point on. Do we have okay, there's an action item being written by Tim right now. Awesome. Okay, cool. All right, next up. Question mark. There's nothing else on the agenda. So before we get into walking the board or the boards, want to see if there are topics that have not been mentioned. Okay. All right. Well, I have one, and it's also related to, somewhat related to the kind deprecation stuff. There was some talk, and I linked it in the chat just now. There was some talk about another PR that adds a code block to capture the primary SIG associated with the PR, right? I am not a strong -1 to this, but I'm pretty against it because I feel that it starts to confuse people. I would like to see less things go into the template in general, and two, are we going to make this a requirement for people to list primary SIG? What if they don't know what the primary SIG is? I know that we were talking about if primary SIG doesn't exist, then it's just then we do nothing. But essentially the idea was to enable a primary SIG field within the PR template or an additional label. I am huge -1 to the additional label for primary SIG so that we can capture who is taking point on that work, right? Sasha, I don't know. So Sasha was saying, how about allowing only one SIG for PRs, right? By default, if you touch, yeah, exactly, Josh. So we have so many interconnected pieces of code, I think it's impossible to just say only one SIG does only one piece of stuff, right? Then additionally, we have sub-projects that are listed as, mostly listed as areas within the code across multiple repos that represent, maybe this is a sub-project or a working group that works across multiple SIGs, right? Something like Kate's Infra, for example, right? That's something that could potentially touch release engineering, testing, contributor experience, like a few different places. So I think it's impossible to just get this down to only one SIG, right? We also have within the owners files, you can create labels, right? Or you can list labels so that when a PR is created that touches a piece of code within the scope of that owners file, it'll automatically get labeled as that SIG or that area or that working group or what have you, right? So I think it's very hard with the current system that we have to drill that down to just one SIG, and I don't think that we should try to. From the, I think maybe we should try to understand what the goal is here for release notes. I know that one of the goals is to make it easier to see within the release notes exactly who's responsible for something, or IPv6 for example, right? That's primarily network, but it's going to touch node, and it's going to touch auth, and it's going to touch a bunch of different places, right? So Sasha, since you have been doing release notes for a few cycles, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, so the main intention was to provide better visibility of the major SIG for a release node and the interconnection between the SIGs and the release nodes. So we want to provide an automatism how to read the release nodes as which SIG introduced which change. And this is currently not really possible and makes the overall quality of the release nodes really not as what we want to have. I think so.
So from the release notes website today, it is, I'm looking at it right now, it is possible to just kind of click on one SIG and see what they've been up to. So what additional benefit would we be getting by introducing this?
It was more about the markdown version of the release notes. Okay.
Do we feel that benefit is enough? It is worth introducing potential confusion?
No.
Yeah, I feel like it's not.
We'll still end up with PRs that are 50-50 splits.
Yeah.
And what exactly we're going to do with those?
Yeah, agreed. So I want to get a few more thoughts on this one, but I think that we should close the loop and close this PR out and close the idea out if it sounds like it's more frustration than it's worth.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Other people want to chime in? I mean, don't all talk at once.
I can say, I think. My only question was, what sort of problem would it solve? What sort of value would it add to have the main SIG of contact, if you want, on the release notes? Do we expect that people will look at it and then go and ask for support on the specific feature to that specific SIG? Or I guess what was the ultimate motivation of having the owning SIG in the release notes?
Sasha? Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, maybe we could also reduce it and remove the SIGs from the release notes from the markdown version. But we just need some categorization of the overall release note entry,
Yeah, and just to be clear, I wasn't suggesting that anything changes. I'm just saying that if there is a use case for that, so if we see people saying, "Oh, I wish I could know the SIG because there's this thing that I want to do," then fair enough. But if not,
I'm not sure. I'm really not sure, because we also have a lot of manual effort for the release notes. We have this template for the final release notes, and this is just manually editing and putting the stuff into the right section, so there's no automatism behind it.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, I think today what we do is it essentially, if it touches multiple SIGs, it says something like courtesy of SIG network and SIG cloud provider and SIG blah 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 blah, right? So the idea was I guess having something that was more clear about who owned what, even if multiple people were involved. But if we cannot discern a clear motivation for doing this, we shouldn't do it. If someone wants to come up with very clear motivation and how it won't create pain for the current workflow. If we don't know what if we don't even know what the current workflow is for people who read release notes, we should try to expound on
that. I would say we could try it out and have a look what it looks like without any SIG in the release notes.
if we are, yeah, if I agree with Josh that the effort trade-off is kind of bad. Realize that when we do something that touches Kubernetes, we touch everyone, right? So like if we were to, there are diminishing returns for trying this in a place like Kubernetes release or SIG release because it's mostly release people touching that work. And if we go the route that we want to do it for Kubernetes, know that we are going to touch everyone. So this needs to be a global discussion again. And I feel like a lot of people will have the same thought around it being a bad trade-off. But, huh?
Do we have any stats on the new release notes website? Like one of the ideas we'd had was if we don't have it split every which way by every possible categorization in the static markdown, but we refer off to the website, then people can dynamically search for whatever criteria they're interested in that moment. I'm wondering if people are finding that useful, because that could give us a path to further simplifying the markdown file.
Yeah, so we had a survey about the website and the markdown version, and the major outcome was that the people want both.
Of course they do.
It also depends a little bit on who is reading the release notes.
So if we weren't chopping up the release notes by SIG, what would we be chopping them up by? Otherwise, you have a list of 1,000 release notes sorted in alphabetical order, which I don't feel it improves the situation. I mean, obviously, people using the interactive tool, you can categorize them however. But for the version that goes out over feeds, what do we want to do?
Yeah, that's also a good question. I had a pull request open to automatically put them into some sort of categories based on the text of the release notes and the SIGs they are involved. So it works somehow, but it doesn't produce reproducible output for sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing that would be obvious, because, I mean, I'll actually put it right out there that dividing the release notes up by SIG is not a benefit, a strong benefit for non-contributor users. Like, people who don't contribute to Kubernetes don't understand our SIG system and they don't care. I mean, they vaguely understand that things in SIG networking might have something to do with networking, but they don't understand the difference between SIG API and SIG API machinery, nor should they really have to. Or SIG UI versus SIG UX. One thing we could consider is actually looking at what release notes sorted by kind label would look like. Or even kind and size or priority. That's a little more iffy. Because like I feel like most users would care more whether something is a feature or a fix or a deprecation than they would care whether it belonged to SIG node or SIG storage. I don't know if other people agree.
Yeah, I think it's a matrix of things that people would care about. And at any one point, like what I may be, like I personally, I have very low need to review the release notes, right? I do a sweep when the drafts come up, but I'm not so much a consumer of Kubernetes than one of the gremlins working in the background to make sure it works. So like I don't have it, like if I care about a deprecation or a new process that's coming in, I've probably heard about it before it gets on the release notes page, right? So that's my personal, that's my personal view. But like we should, if we feel this way, we should try to categorize the personas that are involved in release notes. And I think, I think that area is kind is a good place to do it. I think I think the cross section of kind and SIG is probably the right way to do it. And that's probably close to what we're doing right now anyway.
I think we're going to find priority is mostly useless.
Yeah, priority will be dependent on who designates the priority, right? So it's their scoped priority. All right. So is anyone interested in taking that on, trying to discern personas who are touching our release notes?
In the Zoom chat, Sasha volunteered to do a little demo of what it might look like some other ways.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. So I am. So for the final item, which we're just about out of time, but for the people who are reviewers, approvers, generally interested in some of the stuff, I have linked, trying to clear out my Kubernetes, and I've linked a bunch of PRs that I'm either reviewing or have opened that I would love some feedback on. Some of them are like updates to the, let's see, so we're removing, or we're reconfiguring Hypercube to be a script as opposed to binary so that we can chop down some dependencies. If you're interested in reviewing that, there's a PR open for that. We really need to document the criteria by which we determine a failure is tolerable. I'll mention this in the release team meeting as well, but we need more reviewers on that PR. The kind deprecation label we mentioned. Quick one on increasing the intervals that our test build jobs run at. That is a quick one to approve if anyone wants to look at that. I did some rearranging of the dashboard configs to make them less bad. Some of the automated tests and some of the automatically generated test jobs have been weirdly configured over time. So if anyone wants to take a look at that, there is, what else is there? Updates to the release cut template. So release engineers who are on the call, release managers who are on the call can take a look at that one. And then last one is the branch fast forward tool doesn't actually fast forward stuff. It fast forwards stuff as well as doing an update to the Open API spec, which starts a Kubernetes, downloads etcd, installs etcd, starts a API server, we figured out all to change a version number within the API's spec. And it's something that could just be done with a search and replace or not done at all. So there's a PR to remove that from branch fast forward. And with that, so again, if anyone wants to review some of those PRs, feel free. With that, we're going to jump over to people who are involved, jump over to the Kubernetes release team meeting. Thanks a lot, everyone. Later.